Hey everyone, my name's Christy. Welcome to my corner. Thanks so much for joining me today for this historical baking episode. I don't know what number it is, but it'll be correct in the title. And today we are revisiting the disastrous election cake. But before we get to that, I want to welcome my new subscribers and welcome back everyone who's been hanging out with me. I have loved getting to know you in the comments here on YouTube and also on Instagram. And if you are not following me on Instagram, you can find baking that I do there that I don't film. You can find pictures of my embroidery projects in mid-embroidery, pictures of my dog, teaching, life history, all sorts of things. So if you want to follow me there, you can find me at Dr._Christy. I'll put that right here. And this is a channel about embroidery and other textile crafts and baking and history and the history of those things. So if any of that sounds interesting to you and you're not subscribed, I would love to have you subscribe. So like I said, we're going to revisit the election cake. And I did this back in November for the election. And you can find the video, I think it'll be right here. I can't remember which side it's on, but I think it's over here. And it was a disaster. The history is great. So if you want to learn about election cakes, then definitely check that out. My friend, Dr. Sue Stanfield from Texas, studies these kinds of election cakes, and she was kind enough to do an interview with me and tell us all about election cakes. Yeah, so if you want to learn more about the history of election cakes, then you should definitely check that out. So it didn't go very well. So we're going to try again. And this is in honor of the inauguration of Joe Biden and also the Georgia election a couple weeks ago. And I already am sort of prepped up. This is going to be a quick episode because I have work to do in a bit. And I have been kind of working for a while. So, but I did want to bake something and see if we could do it this time. Can we do it? I think we can. So what I have here is, well, let's talk about this. So this recipe is from the National Cookbook by Hannah Mary Bouvier Peterson, which was published in 1856. Well, this version was published in 1856. There are other versions that were published later, and Hannah Mary Bouvier Peterson was both a cookbook author and also an author of a conduct manual and also a scientific author. So you can find out more about her up here. I'll post a link to other videos I've done about her other works. So one of the issues with these recipes, for those of you who haven't watched these historical baking before, is that we don't get very much information. So the election cake is, I'm going to do a half recipe, by the way. The election cake is 2 pounds of sugar, 3/4 of a pound of butter, 1 pint of milk made into a sponge, 4 eggs, 2 tablespoonfuls of cinnamon, and flour enough to make a dough. And then the directions are: set a sponge the evening before with a pint of milk, a gill, which is a half a cup, of yeast, a little salt and flour enough to make a thick batter. The next morning, stir the butter and sugar together, whisk the eggs, and add to it with the sponge and other ingredients, and flour enough to form a dough. Knead it, butter your pan, put in the dough, let it rise when it is like bacon. Where I went wrong last time is that I used too much flour. I was confused by the knead it, thinking it was like a bread kneading. It's not. I don't think it's like a bread kneading. I think it's like cookie dough consistency, like a wet cookie dough consistency. Because what happened last time is that it didn't rise at all. So what I've done already is I've already done the sponge. So here we have a very nice sponge, actually. And basically this is just the yeast and milk and flour and salt. And this has risen beautifully. So I know that my yeast is active. So this recipe is from the 1850s, which is before chemical rising agents were common. And it's before baking powder is invented. So what I'm using is basically my sourdough starter. I baked sourdough bread yesterday and today, and so I had some starter left, and that's what I'm using here. So that's what this sponge is. So what I'm going to do right now is mix 2.5, because I'm doing a half thing, I'm doing a half batch. So I'm going to mix 2.5 cups of sugar and 1.5 sticks of butter, and then add the 2 eggs and the cinnamon. And then we'll see how much flour I need. So this already has 1.5 cups of flour in it. I'm probably not going to add more than another cup. we'll see. I think last time I added like 7 cups of flour or something ridiculous. I mean, it was a complete disaster. I'm not even kidding. So I'm going to put in 2.5 cups of sugar, mix that all around, and then we will put in the eggs and see where we are. And when I said 2.5 cups of sugar, I of course meant 2 1/4 cups of sugar. So let's mix this together. And this is room temperature butter. And in fact, I'm going to put a little salt in this. So I always put a little pinch of salt in whenever I have to use butter in these recipes because I use unsalted butter, but butter in the 1850s, of course, would have been salted for preservation purposes. So I'm going to mix this all together. And this is when normally I would also use a mixer, but apparently I'm not today.
Mixing this took about 3.5 minutes, and I put a very small pinch of salt in just to kind of up the flavor because, like I said, butter in the 1850s would have been salted, but I use unsalted butter in my baking, as most people do.
All right, I'm going to put in the eggs, and then I'm going to put in the cinnamon. I'm putting in 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. Alright, so I have like a cinnamony, eggy, buttery, slurry that is going to go into the bowl. And which bowl is bigger? That's the question. So I think I'm going to put it into this bowl so you can see what's going on better. It has more weight. Alright, so now I want to mix this all together. I think I should have mixed, well, it'll be fine. But I should have mixed the eggs into the starter and made it into the sponge and made it runnier. That's what I should have done. But I didn't. So I don't think it matters in the long run, but it would have made it easier to mix because the yeasts would have been thinner. We now have a kind of a sloppy, liquidy batter here. And I'm going to add flour 1 cup at a time until it turns into a wet cookie dough consistency. And I'm just using all-purpose flour. The starter had whole wheat in it, so it's kind of a mixture of all-purpose flour and whole wheat flour. There's cup 1. That is still definitely too runny, so we're going to go cup number 2. I'm going to try using this. This is a dough whisk. Let's see if that is easier. So that's 2 extra cups. I'm going to put in 1 more half cup. And I think I'm going to call that it. We're going to see. I'm going to do 2.5 cups. And call that done. Need to refill all my containers though, apparently. Yeah, that feels, whew, arm's tired. Feels difficult to stir, but it's like a wet cookie. I'm going to go with this. So now I need to put it in a tin and let it rise for a couple hours. Dr. Stanfield used a tube tin, like a bundt pan. I don't have one of those, so I think I'm just going to use a springform pan because that's what I have. So I'm gonna cut some parchment paper and put it in the bottom. Yeah, I'm gonna get some parchment paper, put that in the bottom, and then put this in it. And that should be, this is a lot. That should be big enough, I think. I think that's the biggest pan that I have that will hold all of this dough. I'm very glad I did a half batch. So I'm gonna pause you and get that taken care of. All right, I have my springform pan with the parchment paper. So I'm just gonna put this in there and then leave it to rise. And then we rise until it's light. And then it just says to bake it. So I'm going to actually do a little bit of research and see like what temperature. I think it's supposed to be like 325. I think it's supposed to be like a slow oven, like a 325 oven for a long bake. I think that's what it is, but I will look it up and I will let you know. Yeah, so I'm gonna put this in here and until it's full. All right, here is that. Okay, so it's in the tin. I'll take a picture of this and insert it right here, and let's hope for the best. This is gonna rise, I expect, for a few hours. It's nice and warm in here, so yeah, I'm pretty hopeful that this will work. I guess we'll know later on, and if it doesn't work, I give up on the election cakes. All right, I'll see you in a few hours.
On the left is the picture that you just saw, and on the right is the quote rise after about 8 hours. And as you can see, it didn't rise. So I was very discouraged, and in the next day I let it rise overnight essentially, and then the next day I put it in the oven with the light on because the light provides kind of enough heat for it to be a bit of a proving drawer. And this is what it looked like after a couple hours in there. Again, almost no change at all. So I thought I would just stick it in the oven. So I did.
Well, it's the next day and I have a cake. Well, I wouldn't call it a cake. And I knew that it was going to be a weird textured cake because if you watch my interview with Dr. Sue Stanfield, she talks about how her colleagues, when she brings in the election cake, are like, you promised us a cake. This isn't a cake. But what I do have here is a kind of a dense, almost like a bread kind of cake. But it did rise, and I didn't think it was going to rise. I gotta be honest with you. This is the next day. I let it rise overnight here, and there was no movement. And then I thought, well, what if and so this morning I woke up, no change. So I put the light on in the oven because that creates a warm environment, which is good for proving. And this is yeast, and so I thought that would help. And it didn't make any difference. And I'm like, well, you know, baking is magic. So I will turn on the oven and see what happens. And after about probably 30 to 40 minutes, I saw a movement in the center. And I was like, oh my God. I texted Sue and was like, oh, all caps, my election cake is rising. And I sent her a picture. And so what I think happened, I haven't tasted it yet, so I'll taste it on camera with you. But what I think happened is that the yeast kind of built up little pockets of air that then, when it was heated, expanded and rose it. I think it could have been in the oven a little bit longer. I cooked it at 325 for an hour and 15 minutes because it's dense and thick. And it's mostly cooked except for right in the very middle. But, let's try this. Yeah, I mean, it's not a cake, right? It's not a cake. But it's kind of fluffy. It's almost like a slightly dry, like banana bread or zucchini bread recipe. Very cinnamon. It's just cinnamon in there. That's all I put in there. There are other recipes that call for things like currants or raisins or brandy, like soaked fruits and stuff like that. But I went with the one that was in the book. And this will be gorgeous with coffee or tea. So I'm pretty pleased. So everyone, I was expecting this to be like, I was planning on baking it being a failure, not even editing the stuff I did yesterday, just recording like a 3-minute video apologizing for being terrible at historical baking. And instead, what I had brought you was a fairly successful, I mean, this is a little bit fluffy. This is fluffy. I'll post a picture right here so you can see what it looks like now. But, I mean, that's fluffy. It's dense. It's very dense. But I think it's supposed to be dense. I mean, it doubled in size because this is where it was. And it rose like that much, so I'll call this one a success, my friends. I'm pretty pleased. So there you go. My dog's right there. Do you want to be on camera? Do you want to see everybody? Here's my pop-ups. I won't put them too close to the cake. Look right here. Yeah. I know, you're like, what is going on? You're like, what is going on? Anyway, in honor of the inauguration and the Georgia election, I have baked a successful election cake, which feels like a good omen, I hope. Although I don't believe in omens, as you all know. If you enjoyed this or my other videos and are not subscribed, I'd love to have you subscribe. And I will see you in my Friday floss tube where I have quite a lot to talk about. I'm pretty excited. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Please take good care of yourselves and have a good one. Bye.